Good morning, everyone. If you're wondering about our in-person gatherings, then we're back. We've been back in person since Easter Sunday, and we hope we will be able to continue to gather in person every Sunday now going forward. So check all those details out on our website. We'd love to see you in person at 9:30 on a Sunday morning. We totally understand, though, that there are very good reasons why for some of us that in-person gathering is not suitable just now, and so we are equally committed to this online celebration at 10:45. So whether we're in person or online today, we're continuing our series called The Reset, and we're thinking about the way that God helped his people in the Old Testament travel through the biggest crisis of their lives, how they coped with their lockdown when their lives were incredibly disrupted and when they began to think that maybe life would never be the same again. So many parallels with where we are now, but God helped them through. He reset them. The theme, the title of our series, he powered them back up into a glorious future, and that's what we're believing for ourselves and for one another. We're at the particular stage in the journey when we're thinking about God helping us deal with our feelings during a crisis. Any crisis brings all kinds of emotions, fear and panic, anger, disappointment that leads to bitterness and regret, or resentment and so on. So loads of emotions. And unless you've been under a rock right now, you'll be aware that all of us are more highly strung perhaps than normal. There are emotions everywhere. So how do we handle those emotions well? Well, we began thinking about that last week. You really need to catch up with last week if you missed it in all the usual places. When we looked at the book of Lamentations, and we reminded ourselves that if we don't channel our emotions properly, they will find a route that is not proper. If we don't give them the right place to go, they will find the wrong place to go. So we need to deal with them well. And the book of Lamentations is there in the middle of the Bible to remind us that God gives us space for our lament. For these next two Sundays, we're looking together at the book of Job. Job is another one of these books that kind of stands outside of the history. It's there to make some significant points to help us journey through this time, a bit like the book of Jonah that we talked about, and Ruth to a certain extent, and Esther that we haven't looked at yet, and others beside that kind of don't so much fit in a particular chronology, but teach principles that help us as we journey through these times of crisis, and this crisis in particular. So the book of Job begins with introducing Job himself, who's a person who has everything that we might dream of. He's got possessions, he's got prestige, and he's got people around him, a large and loving family. Possessions, prestige, and people. The very things, if you like, that all of us long for. And then suddenly, out of a clear blue sky, he loses everything. In one day, he loses the lot, including his 10 children that are killed. It is an overwhelming tragedy that Job faces. And the question the book of Job begins to ask and to answer is, how does Job respond in the face of suffering? And how should we respond in the face of our suffering? When we hear about Job, there is probably one question that comes to all of our minds. Why? Why did that happen? The Bible tells us that Job was a righteous man. He was a good guy. Why did that bad thing happen to this good guy? And we say that so often, don't we? Why did that bad thing happen to that good person? Why? But God has a different question. We might be asking why, But the book of Job is teaching us that even in the midst of suffering, there is a better question that we need to be asking. And we find that question earlier in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, when it makes very clear that the primary question that God is asking is whether we love him. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Do you love me? In fact, centuries later, when Jesus was asked, what's the most important commandment? What's the most important question? What's the big deal? Jesus had no hesitation in saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Even in the face of suffering, and that's what we're introduced to here, and I'll explain why in a moment at the book of Job, we might be asking, why has this happened? But God's asking a bigger, more transcendent question. Do you love me? What's the connection? How do those things go together? Well, the book of Job helps us to understand, I think, how these things go together. Because we are given a little bit of the backstory about what's happening. And I don't think we should draw huge conclusions about the nature of God and the nature of Satan. There's a lot of anthropomorphism in these chapters, so that these beings are given kind of human characteristics. It's not altogether helpful to draw too many conclusions, but there are some key principles here that are there in the scriptures to teach us. You see, Satan is making the point to God that the reason Job loves God, is because God has given him all of these great things. That if we had possessions and prestige and people, then surely we would love God. If we had everything that was good about life, then we would love God. And that's what Satan's saying. You can't point to Job, and Satan's saying this to God. You can't point to Job and say, look how much Job loves me, because he's only loving you because his life is full of the good things that you provide. And God says, no, Job loves me anyway. Watch and see. And then that calamity. One day, out of a clear blue sky, Job lost everything. How did he respond? The Bible tells us that Job responded in love to God. We call that worship. Job wasn't put off from loving God because he'd lost everything. In fact, this is part of the secret. Job's love for God was bigger, more transcendent than everything that he had lost. And then as you go into chapter 2 of the book of Job, the whole cycle repeats itself. Satan says, yeah, but if you take Job's health away and his marriage fails, then he'll stop loving you. And that's exactly what happened, that Job became sick and his wife struggled with all that was happening with them and longed that Job would curse God, but Job wouldn't. And he goes round the cycle again. But Job continues to love, to trust, to worship, to honor God, even though everything that he had been taken away. It's a remarkable story. And so, who won? We can see that Job's love for God defeated Satan. It proved that Satan was wrong. Satan had said to God, do you know what? Job only loves you because of the good life. If you take away the good life, then Job will no longer love you. And God said, look, watch and see. And Satan was defeated by Job's love for God. Now, when we are full of the question why, and that builds resentment and anger and bitterness and all those things that are in so many ways so natural and normal. But if that's all we hold on to, if that's all we repeat, if that's all we rehearse in our minds and to one another, what we are demonstrating is that we love the things that we've lost more than we love God himself. Now, I totally understand that seems like a very hard word. And in so many ways it is. And please don't take this out of context of the other Sundays where we've been looking at this journey of suffering and how we respond to it, especially last week and next Sunday. Nevertheless, at the heart of what Job is bringing to us is that when we suffer, it creates an opportunity to prove whether our love for God is bigger than everything else. Whether we really do love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And when Job loved God like that, despite all he'd gone through, Satan was defeated. Which means that if Job hadn't loved God with all of his heart, Satan would have, well, perhaps small w, Satan would have won. Job would have aligned himself with the enemy. So you can begin to see why it's really important, even in the face of suffering, that we seek to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. That we don't fall into the trap of aligning ourselves with the enemy and of demonstrating that actually we've loved what we've lost more than our love for God himself. Now, I know that that is a hard word, and I totally understand, both personally and professionally, the huge, immense suffering that so many of us have experienced and that is common, too common in our world today. So I don't say any of this glibly or lightly, but I think if we're faithful to Scripture, we need to recognize that when we are demanding answers, when we want to know why has God allowed this suffering? Why has it happened? This isn't fair. Why didn't it happen to someone else? Why did it happen when that person was so good? Or what have I done to deserve this? When we're asking our why questions, God is quietly, gently, lovingly, and we'll see this more next week, lovingly asking us a different question. Simon, do you love me with all of your heart? It was as Job loved God with all of his heart that it created a posture in which Job, as we will see towards the end of the book, a posture in which Job was able to receive back God's love, even in the midst of suffering. And that's what got Job through. His love for God and God's love back for him. That relationship of love was what carried Job through this biggest crisis of his life. And that's the posture that will carry us through as well. Loving God with all of our hearts and creating that openness for us to receive God's love back. Please don't misunderstand me. This is not a word that says we need to overlook our suffering because God is good and we just need to love him anyway. No. We need to create space for our lament. Our suffering is very real. Nevertheless, in the midst of that, to discover a love for God that's deeper than what we've lost will create a posture where we can receive God's love back. And that's what carries us through times of trial and crisis. That's what helps us get through times of being powered down. That's what leads us to a reset as God calls us through and onto the other side. God bless you this week.